In today's video, we're going to be creating this particular loop. It's actually very easy to create and we'll be using geometry nodes while explaining every single step that we do so that you get an idea of how you can create different animations using the same techniques that we use in this one. I'll try to go a little slow, so let's go ahead and actually begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we'll zoom in, select the group input and tap X to delete it. Now we essentially want an entire grid from which we have these lines going out, and on those lines we're going to instance these particular circles. So let's first create the grid. For that we have to search for the grid node, which is essentially a plane. We can plug that into the group output, and then we have to change this size from the X and the Y to maybe something like 10 units. And that way we get a fairly large grid. If you want it to be smaller, you can always keep it as just 5 by 5. It's really up to you and what size loop you want. Since I want it to just be 5 seconds long, I'm going to keep it as a 10 by 10 grid. Now you can keep the vertices at the default itself. Because we're not going to be using the vertices, instead we're going to distribute some points on faces. So let's press Shift A and search for the distribute points on faces node and plug that in right here. Now I do want there to be much fewer points, so I'll decrease this density from 10 all the way to something really low. Maybe a value of 2 will be good enough. Apart from that, I want a path to be created for my actual camera to pass right through. So we're going to use a technique that we've done in multiple videos before, where we're just going to delete the points that come very close to the y-axis. So for that, we search for a delete geometry and we search for a position node. Now the position we have to separate into the XYZ components using a separate XYZ node, and we can just plug this in so that we actually get the Y location for every single one of the particles, as well as the X location and the Z location. Now, since we want to delete particles that are close to the Y axis, we can actually check for the X location. Let's go ahead and make sure that we're checking for both positive X and negative X. And to do that, we're going to search for a math node, and we're going to change this math node from add to absolute. What the absolute function does is it ignores all negative values and converts them to positive values. So let's take this, plug it in here, and now we have only positive X values, and even the negative X will eventually get a positive value when it comes out from here. Now let's search for a compare node so that we can compare the X-axis locations with some particular amount that we determined. So let's plug this in here, change this to lesser than, so that if the X position is greater than or less than some specific number, let's say maybe 0.1, then it should be deleted. So let's plug this into the selection of the delete geometry and start playing around with it. So we're checking if the X position is less than 0.1, it should be deleted. So clearly not enough is deleted. Let's start increasing this. And now you can see these points slowly getting deleted and us getting a path right through the center. Hopefully that is good enough. You can make it as wide as you want or as narrow as you want. Maybe I'll keep it at something like this. A value of 0.5 should be good enough. Now on each of these points, let's instance some lines. So for that, we're going to shift this over to the side. Let's press Shift A and search for an instance on points node. Now this instance on points node is going to have to take in one instance socket over here. For that, we're going to use a curve line. Now we could be using a mesh line as well. However, for this purpose, I'm just going to use a curve line. It doesn't make too much of a difference. Let's plug this into the instance. And now we have all of these lines present over here. I want them to be much longer. So this end on the Z value, I'll just increase this till we get some size that we're happy with. Maybe I'll go with a value of 10 meters long. Now that I have this particular grid created, I want there to be many more points onto which we can instance those circles. Because right now, if we were to use an instance on points node, you'd get one right over here and one at the top, because each curve is made out of 2 points only. So let's search for a resample curve node so that we get more points. We'll plug that in here, and maybe I want 40 unique points to be present on this. So let's change this count to 40, and now each line is being separated into 40 different pieces. However, we'll see that when we instance on these points, they will get instanced, but we won't have access over them. We'll actually take a look at that before we do the fix. So on each of those points, I wanted a circle. So let's search for an instance on points node, plug that in right here. For the instance, let's use a curved circle, or we could use a mesh circle. And in fact, I'll just use a mesh circle for this tutorial. When we plug this into the instance, you can see that we're going to get all of these circles present in this orientation, which is obviously not the orientation we want. Apart from that, they're also just the outer rings. We want them to be filled. So first thing, we'll change the fill type from none to n-gon so that all of them get filled. Then the second thing that we have to do is rotate it about the x-axis. So we'll go ahead and change this rotation on the x to 90 degrees, and now we have this sort of a setup. However, they're far too large, so let's go ahead and just reduce this radius all the way down till it's something that perfectly fits next to each other. So I think this radius is good enough, but I also want these to be much smoother. So right now, if we zoom in quite the amount, we can see these edges. I don't want to be able to see the edges, so I'll increase the vertices from 32 to maybe 64, and that'll just round these out a little bit more. Now that I have that created, I actually want these to rotate about the global z-axis. So let's go ahead and try that out. That's where we'll realize the issue. So if we search for a rotate instances node, you'll see that if we were to try and rotate it about the x-axis, okay, that clearly isn't the axis that we want. Let's try the z-axis, and there, now we are getting the rotation. And that seems fine. We want to randomize this so that each one gets a random rotation. For doing that, since it's just the z-axis that we want to randomize, we have to search for a combined xyz so that we get access to the z value separately. Let's plug this in right here, and for the z, let's use a random value node. Now when we plug this random value node into the z value, you'll see that all of these for each line gets one specific rotation. And no matter what you do, you're gonna make each line have the same rotation. Let's increase this max to pi radians, which is 180 degrees. So let's just type pi over there. And now you should get random rotations. But again, each of them is for the entire line. And that is because these instances are just instances. The lines that we resampled are still just instances. We don't have access to the individual points that were created within the instances. So let's go ahead and search for a realize instances node, and that way each point becomes its own point, and now we should be able to control each of these points separately. However, there's still one issue. If we actually see, it's no longer going to be the z-axis. No matter what we change this to be, it does not rotate. So that is not the value that we needed to use. We need to go ahead and change this from maybe the z to the y, and now you see it's rotating properly. Of course, I don't want this to just have rotations on the y that's controlled by this random max value. Instead, I want them to be able to rotate by one single unit every single time. So to make sure that we're able to rotate these separately, all we have to do is search for another math node and change it to add. So let's press Shift A, search for the math node, plug it in right here. Now as we add, we're adding in some angle to this random value, and that's going to be the same for all of them. So when this finishes one full rotation, remember one full rotation is 2 star pi. In that case, all of these will also have finished one full rotation. So that way we can create a perfect loop where we're also animating these rotating. So hopefully that makes sense till now. And let's go ahead and actually make these a little thicker, because right now these are very infinitesimally thin. So if we were to actually look at it from the side, we wouldn't be able to see anything, especially when the overlays are switched off. So it completely disappears. I don't want that to occur because nothing is infinitely thin in the real world. So for that, I'll just search for an extrude mesh node, and I'll plug that in after the rotate instances. However, the extrusion is way too strong, so let's change this extrude offset to maybe 0.01, and that's good enough. However, if you now look at it, they have these hollow faces over here. We need the original face to also be present. So that's very simple to do. All we do is search for a join geometry and plug that in to the original that we have, just like this. But remember, the faces are flipped, so we have to search for a flip faces node, and that way we'll have all of the normals correctly placed, and we won't have any issues with that later on in the shading section. However, let's go ahead and just make sure that this is shaded smooth as well. So let's search for a set shade smooth node. And of course, there are other things that we could do to make sure that even this side is shaded smooth and it looks like one single coin, or we can just select the sides so that we have only this edge shaded smooth and the actual connections to the faces shaded flat. But I'm actually going to leave it like this itself, because I think this looks better, where one side is actually flush with the actual face. So you can see it's very smooth over here, and the other side is not flush, and we have this sharp edge on the other side that's created over here. So I actually think that looks pretty cool. So I'm going to keep it just like that. Now I'm going to search for a set material. And after we add in the set material over here, I'm going to start off with the actual animation. First, let's select the material over here. And then for the animation, let's set all of our animation defaults. Let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 60 frames per second. End frame, I'm going to keep it at 300 so that it's a 5-second long loop. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. I'm going to change the resolution to 200 so that it's a 4K animation. I'm going to change the file format to FFmpeg video, and the encoding, I have to change the container from Matroska to MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. Now that I have all of that selected, I can select my camera and press Alt-G to clear location, Alt-R to clear rotation, followed by RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. To be able to see the camera and everything, I'll just switch on overlays once again, and now you can see where my camera is. I'll press 0 on my numpad to go into my camera view, after which I'll press GZ, followed by 5 to just move it up by 5 units. Now I'll press GY, followed by -5 to bring it to the start of the loop. Apart from that, I do want this to be much more wide angle, so I'll go to my camera properties and I'll change the focal length from 50mm to 25mm, or maybe even 18mm to make this really wide angle. I also think that all of these are way too large, so let's go ahead and just change the scale of all of these by increasing this resample curve node from 40 all the way to 80 so that we have double the number of points. And along with that, we'll have to change this radius for the mesh circle to half of what it is. So take this and just say divided by 2, and that way we get much smaller circles, which I think suits my scene perfectly. Now that I have this created, I'm going to select my camera, change this viewport display taskbar to all the way to 1 so that I don't see anything outside my camera view and I don't get distracted. And then I increase this, press the back arrow to go to frame 0. I'll hover over the 3D viewport and tap I and choose location. Then I'll go to frame 300, press G followed by Y followed by the length of one single unit, which is 10 meters, and then I'll tap I, location. Then down here I'll press T and choose linear so that we get a smooth loop as we go from one side to the other side completely. Apart from that, if you actually take a look at it, it's obviously just ending here. And to prevent that and make the loop actually look like a loop, we'll select this, we'll press Alt-D to create a linked duplicate, then we'll say Y and we'll say the length of each unit, which was 10 units. So we'll type that in and type enter. Then we'll press Shift-R to repeat the action maybe 2 or 3 more times so that there are many copies. And if we just switch off overlays and play the animation, we'll actually get a smooth loop as we pass from this frame all the way back to frame 1. So as long as you don't see any glitch, that should be perfectly all right. Now we can start off with the actual animation of these individual circles. So for those, remember, we were having to play around with the add socket of this random value node before it rotates all of these instances. So on frame 0, I'm going to add a value of 0. And then on frame 300, I'm going to add in maybe 2 full rotations. So let's go with a value of 4 star pi, which is going to be 2 full rotations because 2 pi is 1 rotation. Then I'll tap I and that adds in a keyframe. I forgot to add the keyframe at frame 0. So on frame 0, I'll make this 0 and I'll tap I to add in a keyframe. Then just like before, make sure that you select the node so that you get the keyframes down here and then press T and choose linear. Now when you play the animation, you should have a smooth loop of the camera going through the entire thing while each of these individual circles are also turning. With that, we can start off with the actual materials and shading for this entire scene. So let's switch this from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. And of course, because we have the default cube, the default material is already selected, which we've already set up in our geometry node section. To see the changes, we'll switch our viewport shading to render, and we'll also go ahead and take our default light and press Alt-G to clear its location, and then press GZ just to lift it up on the Z-axis by a little bit. Apart from that, I also want it to be much closer to the camera, so I'll just press 0 to go out of my camera view, and I'll switch on overlays once again so that I can see where my camera is and where the light is. I'll press GY and I'll bring it back to maybe something like this, after which in the outliner, I'll control click my camera, and then in my 3D viewport, I'll press Control P and choose Set Parent to Object. So now let's go back into my camera view by pressing 0, and then you can see what we have at the moment. If we want each of these materials to change, we can go ahead and select it, and with the default material, find out where the nodes are. If you can't find the nodes, again, just tap A to select all the nodes and period on your numpad to centralize the nodes. And over there, I want to make all of these much more metallic. So let's increase this metallic value all the way to 1. And for the roughness, I want them to be much less rough. So I'm going to go ahead and change this from a value of 0.5 to a value of something much lower. Let's go with maybe 0.25. Now that I have these nice shiny pieces created, I can go ahead and actually see what happens when I play the animation. So as you can see, some of these reflect the light and become shinier. Some of them don't reflect the light because they're not at the correct angle. And that just gives this nice shimmering effect, which really adds to this particular animation. Now to actually change the color, I'm just going to change the color of the light. So let's expand this camera and go to the light. Remember, the light is under the camera because it's a child of the camera. Now let's select it. We'll go to the light properties and we'll change the color to maybe, let's say, a reddish color. Of course, you can play around with these. You could maybe give it a yellowish color. Maybe I'll try rendering out a few different colors at the end. But for now, let's keep it at this sort of a color. Then I want the top to be lit by a different color. So let's select this light, press Shift D to create a duplicate, then followed by Z to move it on the Z axis, and let's move it up by maybe slightly less than 10 units. Let's go with 8 units. Now let's change this one's color to something else. Let's go with maybe this sort of a bluish color, so a complementary color, and that's it. For the background, we'll go ahead and switch this from object to world, and we're going to switch the actual world background from this grayish color to a complete black. So just bring this down, and that's good enough. However, I do want there to be some sort of volume, which will help us with the loop over here, and it'll also create some nice volumetrics that'll light up the rest of the scene. Also, to make these reflections look much better, we can go to our render properties and switch on bloom as well as screen space reflections. So when you do that, everything changes, and I think it looks a lot better. Now let's press Shift A and search for a volume scatter node, and that's going to add in the volumetrics. So if we just plug this into the volume socket of the world output, we're going to have the volume way too strong. All we have to do is just reduce this density from 1 to maybe 0.3, and that should be good enough. Apart from that, for these actual lights, when we go to the light properties, we can reduce the volumetric effect that it has by quite a bit. So maybe I'll make it 0.2 for both of them. So even on light 1, we're going to change this volume all the way to 0.2. If you don't want to do that, there's another thing that you could do. Maybe you could change these lights all the way down to 0, both for the light as well as light 1. And then you could add in a third light, which is going to have the diffuse and specular set to 0, and it's going to have only volumetric effects. So in that case, we could use a different shaped light. So maybe I'll go ahead and press Shift A and search for a light, but this time I'll use maybe an area light. Now the area light, to actually see it, we're going to switch our overlays back on. And you see, we can't see it because it has been added in right at the origin over there. So we're going to press R followed by X followed by 90. Or since I want it to be pointed towards the camera, I'll type -90. Now I'll press G and Y to just move it back on the Y axis. Then I'll press 0 to go into my camera view, and I'll press GZ to lift it up. Now I'll just press GY to bring it closer to the camera. And once I have it at a place that I like, I'll actually go ahead and press S followed by Z to just scale it up on the Z axis. Now, after I scale it up, I'm actually going to have to increase the power to make sure that it emits that much of light. Remember, if you start increasing the area, the way this light will look, it'll seem to be much dimmer. Let's go ahead and increase this power to maybe 500. and that way we get quite a bit of volumetrics. Let's reduce this diffuse down to 0. We'll reduce the specular down to 0 as well. And the volume, we can of course play around with the density. Let's maybe make this effect on the volume be only 0.4. And I'll change the color to be maybe that bluish color that we were using for the other light as well. Then I have to make sure that this is also parented to the camera. So control click the camera in the outliner, bring your mouse over here and press Control P and choose Set Parent to Object. Now that you have that, everything is actually set for rendering out the final animation. If you like the way everything's looking, you can go ahead and press Render Animation. I hope that was a fun animation and it wasn't too hard to follow along. I know I did end up speaking a little faster than usual, but I think it was possible to follow along, and you can definitely ask me if you do get any doubts regarding any of the steps by commenting it down below. I will respond and try to clarify them, and I will help as much as possible to make sure that you're able to create this effect just as well. I post videos every single day, so if you like this one, definitely check out other videos on my channel. And until the next video comes out, thank you so much for watching, keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.